Assalamu alaikum, bonjour, welcome back to Peace Beyond Borders, a podcast about people, ideas, and movements shaping a more peaceful world. I'm your host, Ahmed Raza, joining you from Pakistan. The podcast began as a conversation between two countries, India and Pakistan, and has since grown into something larger. I would say a space for global dialogue on what peace genuinely demands of us as individual communities and as species. Today's guest speaker has spent more than 5 decades at the intersection of science, policy, and social transformation. He studied the biology aggression at Yale University, helped author the Seville Statement on Violence, a landmark scientific declaration that war is not in our nature, and then moved to UNESCO, where he directed the unit for the International Year for the Culture of Peace. He was instrumental in drafting the United Nations Declaration and Program of Action on Culture of Peace, a document that has since shaped peace education and civil society work in countries around the world. He is the coordinator of the Culture of Peace News Network, the author of several books, and one of the most quietly influential figures in global peace building. Professor David Adams, it is truly an honor for me to introduce you, welcome you to Peace Beyond Borders. I mean, it is indeed a genuine honor to have you here on this podcast. Welcome.
Thank you, Ahmed.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum and bonjour to everyone. It's my pleasure to be with you and to work for the culture of peace.
Thank you so much, Professor Adams, for your kind words. Okay, Professor, let's talk about just start the conversation from your personal journey, right? You began your career as a neuroscientist, studying that aggression and the brain mechanisms of violent behavior. So I think that is a very different starting point from most of people who end up working in peace. So basically, at that moment, what were you trying to understand in those early years, and what were you hoping to find?
Well, I started doing this after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when for the first time we realized that we could destroy all civilization with a war. And as Einstein said, everything has changed except our way of thinking. And I thought maybe if I could understand the nature of aggression, that would help. In fact, I was wrong. After 25 years, I found out, first of all, that war is not aggression. War is calculated policy by countries or by other groups for their own ends. It's not, in fact, if soldiers are aggressive, it's a problem because they should not be aggressive against their commanding officers. But the commanding officers should not be aggressive either. In fact, when during the first war against Iraq, the general who was in charge was getting angry with his colonels. And the Secretary of Defense of the United States flew to Arabia to tell him, if you attack one more of your colonels, we will throw you out, because there's no place for aggression within the organization of a military. And in fact, with regard to the enemy, it's not aggression. It's just you just have to kill them. That's all. But you don't meet them, so you don't have a relation with them. On the other hand, all the great peace activists, Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, all said that they started action when they were fed up with the injustice. There was righteous indignation, which is a form of aggression. And that's what motivated them to become great peace activists. So I've realized that working on the brain mechanisms of aggression was not helpful. And at that point, I worked with other neuroscientists for the Seville Statement to ask the question if war was innate in human nature, and all of our scientific evidence pointed to that it was not. And we quoted the great anthropologist Margaret Mead in the Seville Statement, saying that war was an invention, and the same species that invented war is capable of making another invention, which is peace.
Okay, I think that's very profound how you started out, Professor. I think I do have a follow up question with regards to the aggression which is in human behavior and it is innate, right? So also when I started out my journey as a peace and conflict studies student, so the very first line that our professors told us that conflict is inevitable. You cannot completely of the element of a conflict from a human behavior. So I really want to understand that then how human psychology can be controlled in a way, the tolerance capacity can be enhanced, and specifically as you are giving examples from the world leaders, right? So how their brain mechanisms can be further enhanced, or they can be further what I would say, further polished in a way that the tolerance capacity when it comes to making decisions can be slowed down, because their one decision can impact the even global humanity. So how we can balance that when it comes to controlling the human aggression with regards to psychology?
Well, let me answer it in a different way, which is that there are very good studies by psychologists who have people to make a journal of what happens every day for up to 1 year to ask about aggression in everyday life. Well, it turns out that people get angry when they feel that the other person has done something which is not correct, which is unjust. And they ask people, in that case, when you got angry, was the result good or not? And most of the time they said, yes, I got angry and that cleared the air and we changed our behavior. But then the most interesting question was, what happened when people got angry with you? Was that good? And the answer was, in most cases, yes. If someone got angry with you, it's because you needed to change something. And so you made the change. So in everyday life, most of the time, anger is good. So it's not a question that we have to get rid of anger. But what we have to do is to learn what I learned in working in Africa for the United Nations, which is that you don't get angry at the person, you get angry at the action that the person has done, which means that the person can change and do other actions so that you're not angry always with the person, but with what the person has done and the person can change.
Yeah, I mean, you are absolutely right. You cannot hate the human being, but you can maybe hate their action, and which can be changed, which can, it is more like a behavior that can be on which you can work out, and it can
That's
be
right.
changed. Professor, I really want to know more about the Seville Statement on violence, which you helped develop and made a very profound scientific, claim that war is not biological inevitable. That is a cultural institution, right? So, how difficult was that to build consensus among scientists around that idea? And what resistance did you face while making the statement?
Well, first of all, within the group, I was very careful to have scientists coming from every culture. And one of the persons who came was a wonderful sociologist from India named Ashish Nandi. And Nandi said we should put into the Seville Statement. By the way, it's called Seville because it was in Seville, Spain, where we were
Oh,
working. And Ashish said we have to say that we have to criticize colonialism and racism as having contributed to war. And we had some Americans who did not want to say that, so we had to have a conflict within the group as to whether we kept that in the Seville Statement, and we did keep it finally. But the big problem was the mass media, because the mass media is controlled by the military industrial complex. All of the big media, the outlets, at least in the West, are under their control. And so, for example, when the American Psychological Association, which is all the psychologists in America, voted to adopt the Seville Statement, and we held a press conference. None of the big press companies would come. And one of them told me on the telephone, that's not interesting for us, but if you do find a gene for war, call us because that's what we are looking for. So the problem was that we could not get any media coverage from the big media. And that's still true today. The big media are still controlled by the culture of war.
okay. I think it is very shocking to hear that when it comes to peace building, so we do get very rare attention, and as you said, that is more like a deliberately attempt to not cover and spread the good message
Let me
because of.
Let me add something, which is that after the Vietnam War, when the media was all in favor of the war, there were meetings of the United States Senate. They were convened by the Senator Frank Church from the state of Idaho. They called the Church hearings. And in that, they demanded that all the big media, like the New York Times and Washington Post and CBS and so forth, testify whether or not they had a CIA agent working with them. And at that point, they stopped the public hearings because it was top secret. But what we know is that all of the mass media had at least one CIA agent working in their organization to determine what they were going to say. And as far as I can tell, that has never changed.
Is it it is still in the practice, right? Professor, how do you see that United States invasion of Iraq? Because we have studied as well the CNN effect, that how media portrayed, the WMDs. So do you also, think that the media played a very big role, the mass media specifically, in pushing America towards invading Iraq?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I wrote, when I left UNESCO, I spent the time to write a book called The History of the Culture of War, which is a book, it's online on the internet, and it goes back to the beginning of prehistory, what has happened with the culture of war until the present time. And there are two conclusions at the present time. The first is that this culture of war has become the monopoly of the state. No one else can make war except the state. In fact, no one else can kill except the state. That's why the state can kill because it has capital punishment, etc., and it makes war. But no one else has the right to kill. And the second conclusion is that the most important arm of the culture of war has become the control of information. And the reason is that most people don't want war. And the people who want war are a very small minority. But since they vote, if they were to vote, they would vote against having military industrial complex. So what the media has to do what it has to do to survive, it has to convince people through the media that they have an enemy, and the portrayal of the enemy is the major task of the major mass media, and that's what protects the culture of war when people believe they have an enemy.
Yeah, Professor, I mean, you are right. And I think culture of war do gets more attention because of the financial incentives being more attached. You mentioned the military industrial complex, which is, I mean, is indeed a classical case study or example of how this culture of war actually magnifies, even though it's very little, but how the media portrays, I think that's how it got a global wider attention, and we have seen that in many global conflicts, as you rightly pointed out. So let's talk about more of your neuroscience journey towards UNESCO, right? Which is a career pivot. So when you moved from Wesleyan University to UNESCO in 1992, you entered a very different world of diplomacy, government negotiations, and institutional politics, right? So what did a neuroscientist bring to that environment that was genuinely useful, and what did you have to learn from scratch when you started working out with UNESCO as a neuroscientist?
Well, first of all, I was very lucky that in 1987, which is the year after the Seville Statement, Federico Mayor Zaragoza, who was a neuroscientist, by the way, and had signed the Seville Statement on Violence, he became the Director General of UNESCO. So he invited me to come to UNESCO to work with the Seville Statement on Violence. And there it was that I talked with him to convince him that we should have a culture of peace program. But that was good because we were both neuroscientists and we both had signed the Seville Statement. So for 10 years, I was able to work at UNESCO because he remained the Director General. Well, he was Director General for 12 years, but I was with him for the last 10 years. And when I was with him, we could work very well. When he left, it was no longer possible. The big countries took over control of UNESCO. They had a new Director General. And they threw me out and they stopped the program for the culture of peace. So it was because of my relationship with Federico Mayor, two neuroscientists, that we were able to do what we did.
Professor, as a follow-up to this, because we really, admire the work of you and that is doing, and all other institutions that are affiliated with it, and UNESCO is also one of them. So, like as you are saying that Federico was a great, supporter, and you also have some very good commonalities with regards to your background. So UNESCO is not an independent body, or its policies got influenced by other institutes, by other global countries, and how one basically the UNESCO chairman or the CEO can actually hold on to that policies which actually matter rather than being influenced by the global countries or the donors or the the funding bodies or agencies.
Well, Federico Mayor was very courageous. The big countries tried to control him, but he refused. And he insisted to work for peace even when they tried to stop him in every way. And it's just that he was very clever and had the support of countries from Latin America and Africa that we were able to make the culture of peace advance. And at the United Nations in New York, there was Admiral Chowdhury from Bangladesh who worked also to save the culture of peace against the big countries that were opposed. So as long as we had Mayor and Chowdhury, we were able to get a lot done. But then once Mayor was gone and Chowdhury was gone, the United Nations and UNESCO do not work for the culture of peace anymore.
I mean, obviously, the mindset of the person matters a lot when he's serving any leadership position, as exemplified by Federico's example. Professor, let's dive more into the culture of peace program. You described it as a supplement and alternative to military peacekeeping, right? So that is a very striking frame. What had you observed about military peacekeeping that made you feel that alternative like this was urgently needed?
Well, it's very interesting. When I was a director in the United Nations system, and I tried to get copies of the evaluations of United Nations peacekeeping missions, impossible. They are top secret. Even a director in the United Nations system does not have the right to see the evaluations of peacekeeping missions. And the reason is that for the most part, they cannot succeed because you cannot make peace with a gun. What we did in El Salvador and Mozambique, we got the people from both sides of the conflict to work together to develop programs in education and culture and communication and science. And then eventually we could get them to work together. We had 20 programs developed in Mozambique and 20 in El Salvador, maybe more. But the big countries refused to fund the programs, and so it didn't work. And in fact, now we see both Mozambique and El Salvador have returned to the culture of war.
Okay, yeah, I think because of the military interest, states aren't that much willing to invest in peace building. But Professor, what have you figured out? Like, why is it so? Like, states aren't that much interested in culture of peace, and they're more interested. Is because of the money factor? Is because of the state interest, security interest, military interest, and how one can, as a global peace builder like yourself, you can convince them. If you are going towards war, that is the cost of war. But if you are going towards peace, you'll be saving a lot of money, and you'll also be saving humanity from a very big humanitarian crisis. So how that can be
Well, there's another thing that I didn't mention from the history of the culture of war. The culture of war has two functions. One is or three functions if you want. One is defense, another is imperialism, but the third and the most important and the most secret is the internal war, which is the use of the military to control any opposition to the political power in place. We see this very much now with the United States, with Trump, who has made an army out of the immigration,
yeah, ice
and that's
ice
that's that's internal control. And they're making concentration camps in the United States now. But the concentration camps will not be only for the immigrants. It will also be for the opponents to Trump, the political opponents to Trump, which is what they did in Nazi Germany. Because finally, over the course of history, the culture of war is not only against other external enemies, but it's against internal enemies. And that's how power structures maintain themselves with the war. That's true in the West, it's true in the United States, it's true in Europe, it's true in China, where the Chinese power is based on the Red Army, and it's true in Russia. So everywhere you go, the culture of war is both external and internal. I published an article in the Journal of Peace Research 30 years ago, which was a history of internal military intervention in the United States, the use of soldiers inside the United States to attack those who were opposed to the power structure. At first, it was used against slave revolts and against indigenous peoples in the 19th century. Then it was used against trade unions in the 19th century. And in the 20th century, it was used against urban riots. And now we see Trump is using it. And Trump may use the military to stop the elections also. We don't know yet.
Yes, I mean, you're right. Since elections are also coming in the United States at the end of this year as well. Professor, let's switch towards culture of peace, what it actually means. So, if someone asked you to explain what a culture of peace actually means, right? Not in a formal policy sense, but in the daily texture of a community's life, right? In everyday's life. So, what would you point to? What does it look and feel like when it is working for a common man?
Well, there are two documents for this. One is a document that defines the culture of peace at the national and international level, and that's the Declaration and Program of Action on a Culture of Peace that was adopted in 1989 by the UN. And that has 8 different points, which includes free flow of information, disarmament, education for peace, sustainable development, equality for women, tolerance and solidarity, democratic participation, and maybe something else. The other document was the Manifesto 2000, which was signed by 75 million people in the year 2000, which says, I will make a culture of peace in my everyday life. And that has 8 points also, like the Declaration of Action on a Culture of Peace. It's actually 6 plus 2. And the same equivalence for equality of women, for listening to understand, for nonviolence, etc., in everyday life.
Okay, so Professor, when you are working on this, can you kindly give an example from any country or community that became very close as to what you actually was envisioning or envision? And conversely, what are some of the most common misunderstandings about what a culture of peace requires?
Well, you cannot make a culture of peace in one country. If you try, the other countries will destroy you. For example, when Allende was elected in Chile back in the 1970s or 80s, he tried to make a culture of peace and he was destroyed by the CIA and the military in Argentina, in Chile, excuse me. So you really cannot make a culture of peace in one country. It's going to have to be a global change.
Okay, so misunderstandings that people actually see about culture of peace.
Well, it's certainly not something passive. It's something very active, but it's not, it's in power.
Yeah, power of non-violence. Right. So your work draws a very direct contrast between a culture of war and a culture of peace, right? So a culture of war, as you describe it, it goes beyond armies and weapons. It includes institutions, media, economy, habits of mind, basically all the affairs of life, right? So how deeply embedded do you think the culture of war is in societies today, including ostensibly peaceful ones?
The culture of war has existed from the very beginning of human history. So if we were to go from a culture of war to a culture of peace, it would be the greatest change in the history of humanity because we have always had the culture of war. And so, yes, it would be a very, very big change.
Okay. Professor, you mentioned the Peace Manifesto, right, which was signed by more than 75 million people, right? And it's still people are considering signing it. What was that idea that made you, thought to start this Peace Manifesto? What was your inspiration? What was running back in your mind? We have to start this out. And how this movement is growing today?
Well, back in the year 2000, when we had Federico Mayor in charge of UNESCO and Kofi Annan at the United Nations in New York, who was also very sympathetic to the culture of peace, we were able to get the entire United Nations system and all of the non governmental organizations associated with it to work with us for the Peace Manifesto. But as I said, once Mayor was gone, that was the end of it, and they shut it down, and I had to leave UNESCO. So since then, they have not worked for a culture of peace. The Peace Manifesto that was signed by 75 million people in the year 2000 has not been signed since. What we are doing now, since we know that the United Nations will not support it and the countries of the United Nations will not support it, we are now working with a new manifesto on the social media. But it's very simple. It just simply says, I'm sick and tired of the culture of war. I support the culture of peace, and I will continue to support it on social media until we win. And then, of course, that means that people have to look up to see what is a culture of war and what is a culture of peace. So on our website, we have the definitions of culture of war, culture of peace.
Yeah. Professor, how much hopeful you are for this culture of peace, right? In terms of getting the support from the countries, excluding United States, I mean for sure at this moment, and also from the people, from the communities whom you have previously worked with and you can think upon, to work with on this peace manifesto. What is the hope that you have in mind at this moment, considering the fact that today we are living in a very fragile world, specifically with the US Iran conflict still going on, and it is impacting millions of people worldwide?
I don't know if you know, there was a very famous peace activist in the United States named Jesse Jackson who died, I think, last year. And it was really a pupil of Martin Luther King. And Jesse Jackson's favorite phrase was keep hope alive. So that's what we are doing. We are keeping hope alive with the Peace Manifesto.
Wonderful.
That's the nature, as Federico Mayor used to say, that's the true human nature. The true human nature is that we can always change.
Yeah, I mean, That is also the beauty of a human nature, that it can be changed.
We
Yeah,
can
I
change.
mean, you are right. Professor, let's talk more about the UN Declaration and Program of Action on Culture of Peace, which you helped draft and is more than 25 years old. Looking at it today, what holds up and what would you write differently? Like how governments implemented its provisions in meaningful ways, or has it largely remained, aspirational?
Well, when we sent the draft from UNESCO to New York. Each of the 8 points in the program of action said what is the culture of war and what is the culture of peace. But the European Union and the United States insisted that you cannot talk about the culture of war in the United Nations. It's a taboo topic. So all mention of the culture of war was taken out of the resolution. So if we could make the resolution again, I would go back to what we did originally, which is to say we have to move from education for war to education for peace. We have to move from male domination to equality for women. We have to move from armaments to disarmament. We have to move from exploitation to sustainable development. We have to move from enemy images to tolerance and solidarity. We have to move from authoritarian governance to democratic participation. That would be the only change I would suggest, is to go back to the original and show how we have to move from culture of war to culture of peace.
Yeah, you are absolutely right that policy level is one dimension, but cultures are ultimately built by people in classrooms, households, and communities. And I want to basically turn that level now. So, education, dialogue, and community action, right? You have extensively written about the role of education in building a culture of peace. What does peace education need to do differently from conventional schooling, and why is that change so hard to make? Like, if I talk about my country, Pakistan, I'm very much like optimistic about peace education also needs to be integrated into the national curriculum. Like a school going child should also be taught about peace education. So how that can be made possible?
Well, first of all, I think the classrooms should look different. Right now, the classroom has the teacher in the front and all the students lined up like soldiers behind their desks in the room. When I taught at the university before I went to UNESCO, I had to teach big classes, and they insisted that I teach a class where I was in the front of the classroom and all the students were lined up like soldiers in front of me, and I said no. So the first day of class, they gave me a classroom. I said, we're not going to meet here. We're going to meet in the stadium. So we went out to the stadium, and I said, you have to buy the book and an umbrella in case it rains. Well, there were 300 students, because you cannot put 300 students in a circle. But the second day, when I came to class, there were 30 students, because the 270 said, I don't want to meet in the stands with an umbrella. So I took the 30 students and we put a circle in the classroom, a circle of chairs. And all the teaching I did for 10 years at Wesleyan, I only taught in a circle. So that's the culture of peace instead of the culture of war. And so the students had to listen to each other. Not just to me. And some of the students were very upset with that. They said, "Why should my parents pay $30,000 for me to come and listen to another student? They paid the professor." And I said, well, you don't understand what is true education. True education is listening to each other.
I mean, that is such a beautiful example and beautiful model that you have implemented. And I really wish such models can also be replicated here in our countries and in other parts of the world as well. Professor, are there any specific like models from anywhere in the world at any scale that you think get right? Like you mentioned one model of making circles and listening to each other. Are there any other models that you have gone through that can be implemented?
Absolutely. There is something called restorative justice, which actually is built on the justice systems of pre-colonial Africa, but it's mostly implemented now in Brazil. In Brazil, for example, restorative justice is required in all of the courts, the judicial system of Brazil. When I was in the United States, we were doing restorative justice circles in schools, and that's a good example. Mediation all over the world. There's work for mediation, and this is certainly culture of peace. And also, wherever you have people who are working against racism and for tolerance, this is culture of peace. So there are many, many examples like that.
Professor, can you also like list on a few countries who are really doing good work on culture of peace and they are actually practically implementing these models in their education, in their institutions, in their communities? Like, if you can name a few countries whom we can take inspiration from.
No, as I said before, you cannot make the culture of peace in one country. If you try, they will destroy you. So I no, I cannot say that there is a culture of peace in one country.
It has to be globally. Professor, let's switch towards the importance of dialogue, which is, I mean, absolutely central to everything. And Peace Beyond Borders actually tries to do that as well. But dialogues across deep divisions between communities that carry historical grievances, right? Between countries that have been in conflict can also be fragile and easily exploited. What have you observed about the conditions under which dialogue transforms relationships, communities, rather than simply coexisting with ongoing hostilities?
Well, first of all, I congratulate you for working on dialogue between Pakistan and India. And that reminds me of a dialogue that we started in 1985 in the United States, which was a dialogue between Russian and American citizens. And we called it the People's Peace Treaty. And people signed it. It was a treaty between the people of the United States and Russia at the height of the Cold War. We had 300,000 signatures in the United States and many millions in the Soviet Union. But this was considered by the American authorities, the FBI, as the most dangerous thing in America at that time. And so they sent spies and agents provocateurs into our midst and eventually succeeded in catching the director of the People's Peace Treaty and putting him in prison. I can still on my website, I have some of the documents which says that they consider this the most dangerous thing in America. So it was completely opposed, this People's Peace Treaty. And I'm sure that in your attempts to get a dialogue between India and Pakistan, you will have similar kinds of attempts to stop it. But this is where I think it's very important, this kind of dialogue, and we must continue to do it. At the end, the People's Peace Treaty didn't finish because I went to the Soviet Union and I talked to the people there, and they said, "You don't know, but our country is about to be destroyed." And so the Soviet Union was destroyed in 1989. It was destroyed because it was a military industrial complex. Country cannot survive if it's only military. But hold on, just one minute. Kiki, je ne peux pas parler avec toi. Yes, I'm sorry. You go ahead.
Yes, what I conclude from your conversation and also from my own personal readings and experiences, that peace building is never an easy path, has never been an easy path, right? It is something which can take you to even scary spots on a personal level. So how as a peace builder one can carefully navigate, and he or she knows actually these are the areas I can talk about, but in a very careful way. So how one can carefully navigate the journey as a peace builder when it comes to talking about topics?
You know, Mahatma Gandhi, who was a great peace activist, used to go every week to the English viceroy, who was the head of the colonial power in India. And he used to tell him what we are going to do. And he would say, we're going to have a march to the sea to make salt or whatever.
Salt
And
Hardy March. Yeah, I remember.
he said, but you are going to have to leave because we are not going to allow colonial power in India. And he would do this every week. And what Gandhi always said is, you always have to talk with your opponent. He is not really your enemy. You just have to convince him that he has to change.
So I think one really has to have that convincing power as well as a peace builder
Yeah.
to make your opponent aware of what you are really trying to do for the benefit of your country.
By the
Professor, you
way,
also have.
an important part about what Gandhi was saying was that we have no secrets. We're not going to do anything secret. We'll tell you what we are going to do. But if we have enough people, you can't stop us.
So we'll keep it as an open secret rather than doing behind the behind the scenes.
Secret.
Professor, let's switch towards youth, which is, I mean, more than 50% you can say of the world's entire population right now, as they are under age 30, right? So you have worked in this field across multiple generation of activists and researchers. How do you assess the current generation of young peace builders? We talk about that in the 21st century, right? The Gen Zs, the Alphas, right? So what do they understand that previous generation didn't, and what do they risk misunderstanding, and how they can carry the legacy forward as well?
What they have a tool that we did not have, and that is social media and the internet. So that the young people today can talk immediately with young people everywhere in the world. even if different, even in different languages, because now with the internet, you can have translation on the internet, which works very well. So today's generation is global, and they can act local and think global in a way that previous generations could not do. That's what gives me hope that this new generation will use the social media, use the internet. In fact, right now, the social media is controlled by a few great, very rich people. But young people today will be able to invent new social media, which is not controlled by the big powers. And that's my hope, is that this new generation will have a dialogue, a global dialogue. That's what the Peace Manifesto is for, a global dialogue for the culture of peace.
And also, Professor, since you are actively working on Peace Manifesto, you're also coordinating the Culture of Peace News Network. Like, if young people they really wanna engage with this global Peace Manifesto and they actually want to work and actively advocate for this cause, how can they do that? How can they engage with you and take this mission forward?
We're on all the social media and on the internet with a very simple phrase: activating peace. If you put activating peace into any social media or into the internet website, our website is activatingpeace.org. Our Facebook is Activating Peace. Instagram is Activating Peace. Our LinkedIn is Activating Peace. Telegram is Activating Peace. Then they can join with us.
Sure. And also, Professor, what is your vision for this Peace Manifesto? Like, for the next 20 years, 25 years, how are we gonna expanding this further? What's the vision that you have in mind?
Well, once it becomes global and we have millions of people who are using the Peace Manifesto, that they will then be able to have a dialogue for tactics and strategy to move from the culture of war to a culture of peace. It's not possible yet to know exactly what this strategy will be, but probably what will happen is that the present global economy will crash because it cannot be sustained by the culture of war. And when it crashes, there will be two challenges. One is just to survive, because there will be big problems: lack of electricity, lack of food, etc. And it will be difficult to live in cities. So there will be mass migrations to the countryside, and people who are in the peace movement, in the global movement for a culture of peace, will have to help with this. By the way, when there is a global crash, there is one institution that can help, and that's the military. Because the military have transportation, communication, stocks of food, tents, etc., which can help. So there will need to be the conversion of the militaries of the world into humanitarian organizations for humanitarian aid. That will be part of the strategy, I think, that the global movement for a culture of peace will need to do. And then eventually there needs to be a complete refoundation of the United Nations so that it is based directly on the people, and so it can make a culture of peace.
And also, professors, since military, right, is a very important factor in governing a country or in at least providing security to any country, how military people can be involved in this peace building? How you talked about, it's all about convincing. So how, as young people or just as policy makers, we can convince them, because we have seen that United Nations peacekeepers going all over the world. Like, if I talk about Pakistan, we also have some military personnel who go to United Nations peacekeeping missions. What do you think? So have they achieved some success, or there is still some more work to be done? And how that engagement can be made possible?
Well, what I'm saying is that if there's a global economic crash and people have to leave the cities, there will need help, and that's when the military can help. But it will not. We don't need guns. We need trucks and food and tents, and they have that. So the military would change from using guns to using their supplies, and that's what the young people should be in touch with. Should be in dialogue with the military for that.
So the conclusion in the dialogues remains to be intact. We should not, completely eliminate the element of dialogue. It should be there.
As Gandhi said, you should always talk with your opponent.
Rightly pointed out. Professor, for someone like listening to this podcast as a young person in Pakistan, India, South Asia, France, Spain, United States, Brazil, Vietnam, Indonesia, Japan, right? Anywhere, who feels moved by the ideas but doesn't know where to start. What is your honest practical advice? Not an inspirational answer, but a real one from your wealth of experiences.
Go to activating peace.
Go to it. Wonderful. Professor, I think so with this question we almost have came to the end of our conversation today, and I just have a very quick, rapid fire with you as well. They will be like one liner questions, and you will be responding in one quick answer, right? So let's start. What is the one peace builder that moved you along your journey? Who was your hero along this journey?
I have three:
Sure.
Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, and Nelson Mandela.
Perfect. So can you quote their famous line that really, is close to your heart and touches you very deeply?
Martin Luther King said, let me see if I can remember it. Trying to remember the line. But you should use your anger as a transformative force to move from a culture of war to a culture of peace.
What is the one book that every peace builder should read? One book.
I have a book called I Have Seen the Promised Land.
The Promised Land.
It's on my website.
It's written by you.
Yeah.
Perfect. So your peace building toolkit for the young peace builders.
Well, that's on Activating Peace, the website.
Activating. Okay. What is the one moment that you still remember?
On the website activatingpeace.org, there is a link to strategy.
Sure. Professor, what is that one life changing moment that you still remember today while you are going through your journey of peace building?
I think when Federico Mayor invited me to come to UNESCO.
You still remember. That is very close to your heart.
Yes.
Professor, how much hopeful you are for the world today? More peaceful world today.
Well, on Monday and Tuesday, I'm optimistic. On Wednesday and Thursday, I become pessimistic. And the weekend is up for grabs.
That's a very diverse combination of optimism. But still there is optimism. I mean, definitely.
As Jesse Jackson said, keep hope alive.
Yeah, I mean, one should be. Professor, one last question. One person that you still remember today who you think so can played a very big role in your life's journey.
Again, Federico Mayor.
He was your mentor.
Well, he was my boss.
Perfect, perfect. So, like, obviously, you are such an incredible person and a wonderful human being. I mean, always also have looked up to you as a mentor, as an inspirational person, and I didn't even know about this that one day we'll be sitting together and having this conversation. So, thank you so much for that. What are some of the names that comes into your mind if we talk about today's world, right? And young people can really look up to them as good peace builders, transformational peace builders.
Well, when I think of Pakistan and India, I think of my friend Ashish Nandi, who is my age but still active in India. Maybe you can contact him in your dialogue. He would be very good. But I think there are many good people in South Asia already that, like yourself, that are working for peace, culture of peace.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think that almost takes us to the end of this conversation, Professor Adams. Once again, thank you not just for your time today, but for the body of work you have built and for the intellectual generosity I would say you have shown throughout this conversation. You reminded me that peace is not a soft idea; it is hard, disciplined, long horizon project that demands the best of our science, our institutions, and our character. So, for those listening, if this conversation has sparked something in you, a question, a commitment, or simply a clear sense of what peace requires, then Peace Beyond Borders has done its job. Professor, thank you with this note. One last thought that you want to share to the world before we finally conclude our conversation.
Well, I hope that this conversation is the beginning of our collaboration, not the end.
Thank you so much. I mean, that's such a powerful message to end this conversation. Professor, anything you want to share in French for all those people who are listening, French? So I really want to also give them a message for those people.
Bon, comme j'ai dit, que j'espère que cette conversation, c'est le début, pas la fin de notre collaboration.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor. It was lovely talking to you today.